we're going to have a look at what I'd term the aerial heirs of Harry Ferguson. First slide there you see is a picture that was an aerial photograph taken the 15th of May 1924, and that shows Belfast Harbour, specifically the Musgrave Channel. That picture was actually taken from an aircraft belonging to 502 Ulster Squadron, which had been formed that year at Aldergrove, just to give it its historical context. So, first slide there is of Harry Ferguson. It can be argued that civil aviation began on the 22nd of August 1910, not the 31st of December 1909. That's when Harry made his first flight. But on the 22nd of August 1910, he took up a passenger, a lady, a very brave lady called Miss Rita Marr. So she was the first passenger to go flying in Ireland. And she came down safely again. In fact, married an Irishman. She was from Liverpool. She was over in Northern Ireland, well, Ireland on her holidays in 1910. She married an Irishman who was a doctor, and they moved to Ireland to live as well. Further details of that are in my book, Pioneer, Showman and the RFC. I'll do a few little as we go on. So anyway, Harry Ferguson, there's Rita by the way, sitting in the front cockpit of the Ferguson Flyer. Lillian Bland. Lillian Bland grew up in Carnmoney. She was actually born in Kent, but the Bland family's roots in Ireland went back to the 17th century at Blandsfort, because it was a Cornet Bland first came over, I think in the time of Cromwell. And Lillian was born in Kent but moved back to the family home, in this case in the north, around about 1903 or something like that. And her father, Humphrey Bland, was a very skilled painter, a society painter. Her grandfather was a prominent clergyman in Belfast. She moved in with her father, her widowed father, to her great-aunt Sarah Smith's house in Carnmoney. Sarah Smith being the widow of General Smith, S-M-Y-T-H, a notable figure, and experimented with constructing a biplane. She flew the first biplane to fly in Ireland in 1910, first as a glider and then with an engine, and was the first woman in the world to design, construct and fly her own aeroplane, and deserves to be remembered for that. So Lillian, a very important figure. And again, I actually do a talk about Lillian's life, but I haven't got the time to do that tonight. That's a little book that I wrote about her. And the third one of these early pioneers is a man called Joe Cordner. Joe was born in Lurgan. He was a self-taught engineer. He had a cycle shop. He moved to Derry and did a bit of flying, particularly at Lisfannon. Flying, I would put in inverted commas, and you can see his monoplane there has got his own patented wing design. We think it may have hopped into the air a few times, but we don't think it made a really successful controlled flight. But oddly enough, of the three of them, of Harry, Lillian and Joe, he was the only one to get his pilot's license, his ticket from the Royal Aero Club. He was a flying instructor at Hendon during the war and came back and did a few joyrides around the north coast just after in 1919 with the son of the Smiles family. The Reverend Smiles in the 19th century was the author of a best-selling book called Self-Help, which if you Google it, you'll find out all about him. So we now move on to the Great War. In the latter stage of the Great War, the Handley Page Company subcontracted Harland and Wolff in Belfast to build the Handley Page V1500 bomber, four-engine, first RAF four-engine bomber. You may ask yourself two questions. Why would you ask the shipyard to build you a bomber? Two answers to this. First of all, they had already built about 700 or 800 aircraft, single-engined Avro 504s and DH6s. And secondly, when you think about the great ships built in Belfast, they all needed a considerable amount of carpentry to build them inside, fixtures and fittings. And aircraft of those days were really cabinet making. A lot of wood, a lot of canvas, and a lot of piano wire. So a skilled carpenter wouldn't have much problem knocking something up. And the chief designer, Volkert, came over to Belfast and stayed in the Midland Hotel, which is just near York Gate Station. It's been demolished years ago. But G.R. Volkert stayed at the Midland Hotel, commuted every morning to Harland and Wolff, and they produced the Handley Page V1500. The testing ground was going to be Aldergrove for the first flight, but unfortunately it wasn't quite ready. So it was shipped, the fuselage and the wings were shipped down to Cricklewood in London, where it successfully flew for the first time in 1918. Other examples were built at Aldergrove, or were built at Harland and Wolff and flown at Aldergrove, flown then over to England. But the war had come to an end and the contract ended after they built about a dozen or so of them. You may ask, what has this got to do with Harry Ferguson's aerial airs? Simply, I'm going to read out to you what it was like flying one of these in 1918-19. As was the custom with nearly all of these early aircraft, the pilot sat in an open cockpit behind a large windscreen with a great wheel in front of him for the controls. There were no engine instruments in the cockpit. They were mounted on paddles on the frames between the wings, holding the radiators of the engines, and the pilot could only just see them through the whirling disc of the propeller. Petrol from the 2,000-gallon fuel tank in the body of the aircraft was fed to the four engines by wind-driven pumps. It was always surprising to me, and that was Sholto Douglas, by the way, who wrote this, who incidentally was sent over to Ireland in 1917 to look for the sites for potential airfields. He picked Aldergrove, Collinstown and Baldonnel. Sholto Douglas later became the chairman of BEA, but he was a jobbing pilot in 1919. It was always surprising to me how well the engines stood up to the caning we gave them. When we opened up the throttles to take off, there was no easing them back after we were airborne. We left them there at full power, as we needed all that we could get out of the engines to keep them going, and that is significant with a view to civil aviation. Part of the toolkit was some chewing gum and insulating tape for quick repairs to the water jackets of those engines. They always seemed to be springing leaks, and the gum was chewed and then plugged in the leak and secured with tape. A little bit difference of our experience with Ryanair or Flybe or EasyJet, but don't mention that to Michael Ryan just in case he thinks it's a good idea. Aldergrove, writing in the Northern Whig, the regular columnist, who was called the Old Fogey, that was his by name, wrote, "Straight on and about a mile ahead, you'll come right on to the drum. You can see it from the railway bridge. I followed the direction indicated by the farmer, and sure enough, from the top of the bridge, I saw ahead a bulky building close to the road. And as I approached, I had ample evidence that the building was Aldergrove Aerodrome, known locally as the Drum. A graceful Avro shot up suddenly from the enclosure into the air, and soon, notwithstanding that a stiff gale was blowing from Lough Neagh, the daring RAF pilot was executing right overhead the most astounding manoeuvre. Watching the performance, I could not help recalling the first flying exhibition in Ireland, held at Leopardstown only 8 years before. How the aviation heroes of that day, Drexel with his Blériot and Grace with his Farman, would have stared with wonder at this unknown pilot with his Avro and his amazing stunts. But the familiarity which breeds indifference was strikingly exemplified by the demeanour of the local labourers, who were sweeping the road in front of the drum. Stolidly, they continued their occupation, lifting not a glance of either appreciation or apprehension towards the Avro. Bear in mind that time, of course, in 1919, 1920, motorised transport of any sort would have been a rarity in the rural countryside around Lough Neagh, because Harry Ferguson hadn't invented his tractor yet, for one thing. The old fogey then quoted Lord Tennyson, who foresaw the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue, followed by the heavens filled with commerce, argosies with magic sails, pilots of the purple twilight dropping down with costly bales. And now we come to commercial aviation. He wrote, "Now the Air Ministry have published a map showing the several routes for the guidance of pilots, and have issued a set of rules of the road and a scale of the charges to be made for accommodation of civil aviators and their machines at government aerodromes, including Aldergrove." At the same time, yesterday's morning's newspapers record how a Handley Page aeroplane, the younger brother, an 0400, two-engined version of the V1500, how a Handley Page aeroplane flew on Thursday from London to Manchester, carrying 10 passengers and some hundredweight of luggage. That was the 1st of May, from Cricklewood to Alexandra Park. And the chief pilot there was actually Handley Page Transport, Sholto Douglas. Old fogey again. Transatlantic commercial flying, in the opinion of experienced aviators, will come in the near future. This was, of course, at the time of Alcock and Brown and Mackenzie King and Harry Hawker and so on. And the importance of Aldergrove may still be further enhanced by its becoming an important transatlantic air station. Then we may expect announcements in the Saturday morning newspaper, such as the following: Belfast and New York air service. Departures from Aldergrove next week as follows: Thursday, Dalriada 3,000 horsepower. Saturday, Ben Madigan 4,000 horsepower. Both Belfast-built airships for passage, apply, etc., etc. Because in 1919, the airship was still looked at as being a potential form of transport. Indeed, the R34 in 1919 made a double passage across the Atlantic to New York and back again. So the old fogey may be forgiven for that flight of fancy. Just another little picture of the V1500 there. The Avro 504 at Aldergrove with 502 Squadron. And here, 1921, King George and Queen Mary visited Northern Ireland in the Royal Yacht to open the new Parliament at Stormont. Flight magazine wrote as follows: "Yet once again the aeroplane has given popular demonstration of its capabilities of playing an extremely important part in modern commerce. Aeroplanes were employed with the most satisfactory results by the press and a cinematographic firm for the purpose of conveying photographs and other important matter between London and Belfast and back." In fact, not only still photographs were taken, but moving images which were actually on show in London that very evening. So skilled were the pilots and indeed the cinematographers. That's a DH-16, which could carry 4 passengers in that little cabin at the back, very cosily indeed. But that was one of the early aircraft that flew to Belfast. And then we have the aerial transport of newspapers in 1922. This, you might say, was the start of the global media village, because a special Ulster edition of the Times, which reviewed the province's economic progress in the year since Parliament had been opened, they were flown from Chester to Aldergrove on the day of publication, the 5th of December, in 2 DH-16s from the de Havilland Aeroplane aeroplane hire service. That's from the Belfast newsletter and shows the newspapers being unloaded at Aldergrove. It's just another close-up of them there. Almost rather like that one if you see the man on the far right-hand side, just staring vacantly at the camera. I'd love to know what he was thinking at that time. Another pile of the, you can see there, Northern Ireland Special Edition. And note, it was an RAF airfield, so there's plenty of RAF personnel around there. 1923, newspapers were flown from Manchester using a DH-9C, which you can see there. Golf Echo Bravo Alpha X-ray, with specially marked vans of Eason's Motor Service by Air Today, meeting them at Aldergrove, where a ton of newspapers was unloaded for, dispatched to all parts of Ulster. What we had just after the war was we had a lot of surplus airframes going very cheap, a lot of surplus engines going cheap. And we also had a lot of surplus pilots who had learned to fly with the RFC or the RNAS. And they wondered if the flying game could make any money. So the bit of sea between Ireland and England was both a challenge and an opportunity. And that's really what we're looking at here, the challenge and the opportunity. There's just again unloading from GEBAX. Now we come to Alan Cobham. He is the pilot there. Alan Cobham, one of the great figures in pioneering aviation in the 1920s and 30s. 15th of September 1923, he flew the first of a short series of flights linking Plymouth, Birmingham, Manchester and Belfast. The main object of these was the rapid conveyance of the incoming American mails, particularly those in respect of the linen trade. There was a great rivalry for the share of the important American market between linen makers in the north of England, Northern Ireland and northern France. It was conceived that an airmail service would allow the British producers a time advantage over their competitors. A few passengers were also flown, including the Mayor of Plymouth, Mr. Sullivan Stevens, and his daughter Laura. Now Laura had merely turned up at Plymouth to wave her father goodbye, but on hearing there was a vacant seat, persuaded him to let her go as far as Birmingham. Once on board, she enjoyed herself so much that she said, well, I'm not getting out at Birmingham, I'm just staying on board. And her father was wise enough not to argue the toss with her, telling the Belfast Telegraph in an article entitled Flying Over the Rainbow. That's Solomon Stevens, by the way, with his blackthorn stick that had been presented. That's him going home again. The aircraft is a DH-50. So here is what Laura wrote for the Belfast Telegraph. They wanted me to leave at Birmingham and again at Manchester, but I wouldn't miss the trip for anything. I liked the trip across the sea, and it was great to look down on Belfast. I saw some boys playing cricket in a field. I was not in the least bit upset and was most comfortable. It was just delicious. When flying over Belfast, she leaned out of the window to view the sights of the city. The 100-mile-an-hour slipstream played havoc with her hair. It was all knotted up, and I could hardly get it fixed in time to look presentable when I landed. You see the chap in the middle in the Homburg hat and the spats, soft hat that is in the middle. That is the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Alderman W.G. Turner. He also took to the air with Alan Cobham for a pleasure trip over part of Lough Neagh, Crumlin, the Cave Hill, Belfast and Belfast Lough, thus becoming the first airborne alderman of the city. He enjoyed his trip. Writing, I was not a bit nervous. The sun was shining brightly in Lough Neagh, which looked very pretty. The fields seemed about the size of postage stamps. We were not far above the Cave Hill, and Mr. Cobham said that we flew over Belfast at a rate of 130 miles an hour. We were 3,000 feet up. It was very comfortable and very pleasant. Alan Cobham later wrote in his autobiography Skyways, the Lord Mayor became a convert to the flying game, convinced that Belfast must develop into an airport. He took him across to England and then wrote, they were very jolly passengers, and I was highly amused when I looked down through the window from the pilot's cockpit to the cabin to see the Lord Mayor had turned the shelf in front of the cabin into a miniature cocktail bar and was busy administering liberal doses of a famous extract into several glasses. After handing drinks to Sir Sefton Branker and the journalist on board, he then prepared one for me, but was prevented from handing it through the cockpit window by the Director of Civil Aviation, that's Sir Sefton Branker, who said it was against the rules for the pilot to drink during flight. The cockpit window was open, and the odours that wafted through told me it was a good brand. That picture, by the way, is taken at Aintree, because the Lord Mayor had become, as we've said, a convert to the flying game, and he persuaded Belfast City Council to develop Malone Air Park, which is near Balmoral Golf Course, and it's now where the Tockmona housing estate may be found, and there's no memorial or anything like that, unfortunately. But it was opened as the first municipal airport in the British Isles in April 1924. A very bold concept which proved to be ultimately unsuccessful as it was ahead of its time. There's the opening of the airport at Malone. William Turner, still in spats, making a speech. The man to his right with the eyeglass in and the moustache, that's Sir Sefton Branker. He was a very dapper figure. That is the ground at Malone, and you can see it's rather muddy. We'll come back to that later. That's another DH-50 on the ground there. That's a philatelic cover from Malone, flown by air, from Belfast to Liverpool. There's Alan Cobham and the Lord Mayor again, so he went flying quite a few times. Another heading from the newsletter, Alderman Duff, Miss Ingram, the Reverend H.G. Maturin and Alan Cobham. 8th of May, 1924, first lady passenger to fly with Northern Airlines she was Sarah Ingram, the departmental manageress of Eason and Sons in Belfast. Her flying companions were James Duff MP, Reverend H.G. Maturin of the Seamen's Mission, and of course Alan Cobham, and they were waved off by the Lord Mayor from Malone. Miss Ingram reported her experiences in the Belfast Telegraph, and this is what she wrote. It was simply great, and I enjoyed the flight tremendously. It was the smoothest journey I've ever experienced. The machine was much steadier than a motor car. I dined on board with Alderman Duff and Mr. Maturin, who are my fellow passengers. She also had the time and forethought to record the timings of the flight. Left Belfast 6:14 p.m. Passed over Donaghadee 6:22, quite a fine sight. Passed over the Mull of Galloway 6:37. Sighted Burrowhead 6:48. We then crossed Wigton Bay, saw Little Ross Lighthouse, and then flew over the Solway Firth to Maryport, where I was told the machine was observed by the watchers. These were people, en route, who were told roughly when to expect the aeroplane, and if it didn't fly overhead when it was supposed to, within a few minutes, they would raise the alarm. We came down the English coast over Workington, Whitehaven and Barrow-in-Furness. It was now 7:40. We crossed Morecambe Bay, and then we sight the Blackpool Tower. It was a grand evening, and as we fly over Blackpool, we can easily read the sign outside the Winter Gardens and can see the time by the Water Gardens clock. It is 7:54. We reached Liverpool at 8:10. That's just a nice picture of Belfast, 1924. You can see the City Hall. Just over to the right-hand side of the picture. That's Little Ross Lighthouse that Sarah Ingram was referring to. And that is Blackpool, and you can see the big wheel and the tower. Wasn't taken on her flight, but close to that time. More de Havilland Air Service pictures. Interestingly, later in the month, Councillor Milan of the General Purposes Committee in Belfast Corporation raised the following point. All corporation deputations visiting cross-channel centres should, as far as possible, now travel by the Northern Airline, and that company be approached with a view to a special reduced rate for public representatives when travelling on public business. Politicians, of course, would never think of doing that nowadays, would they? Getting something on the cheap, or better still, free. Or perhaps I'm just cynical. So what else do we have? Move on from that one. There's a nice montage of Northern Airlines base at Malone. When I was writing the little book about Malone, I corresponded with a man called Bob Howe, who at that stage was an octogenarian. When I was about 11 years old and living on the Stranmillis Road, a pal and I heard that for the first time some Belfast telegraphs would be flown across the water from Malone. So the two of us went up in that direction. We could have walked, cycled, or gone up in the tram, I can't just remember. The area is now the Torquemona estate. We went into the fields and got as near as we could to where we saw a reddish fabric-covered single-engine biplane with some fuss going on around it. We lay on our tummies at the bottom of the nearest thorn hedge, as close as we could get to the group, and I'm quite sure we waited for takeoff. This was about the third week in March 1925. Malone only existed for that time, 1924-25. They tried routes to Liverpool, to Carlisle, to Glasgow, and even an internal air service from Belfast to Derry. Just wasn't financially viable. Number one, Malone was very poorly drained, so quite often they had to divert to Aldergrove. Number two, the aircraft which you've seen were quite small, and they couldn't really carry a sufficient volume of either passengers, mail, or newspapers to make it an economic proposition. Also, the landing aids were virtually non-existent, so they were very, very weather dependent, because obviously if there was very low cloud, you wouldn't want to get lost coming over the North Channel. So for those variety of reasons, it was an idea that was just ahead of its time. So we now move to 1928. In the 1920s, flying boats were regarded as having a great deal of potential. And you could certainly say the heyday of flying boats was 20s, 30s and 40s. A trial service between Liverpool and Belfast Harbour was flown between the 24th September and the 4th of October 1928 using a short Calcutta, which had been hired from Imperial Airways. It was subsidised by the city corporations of Liverpool and Belfast. The fare was £3 10 shillings single and £6 10 shillings return, which would have been quite a lot of money in 1928, because if you were a working man and you're earning a couple of £100 a year, you'd be doing all right. If you're earning £500 a year, you'd be doing very well indeed. And if you're earning £1,000 a year, you'd certainly be a very well-established professional at the top of your tree. The cargo in an early flight, by the way, included the first delivery of Irish eggs to be sold in Liverpool on the day that they were laid. So that's a famous first for you anyway. If you wish to amaze your friends, you can say, when was the first egg sold in Liverpool that had been laid in Ireland on the same day? And the answer would be 24th September 1928, or you may not want to. Belfast Newsletter arranged for a private flight for that group of people. By the way, do you notice where it says HMS? When I was a little boy, in a little sort of tin of bits and pieces that my father had, in fact, it was one of the Queen Mary tins that was given to all the troops in the First World War. It had in it my grandfather, my great-grandfather's medals, and a few other things, but it had a little blue badge. And the little blue badge had on it the name HMS Catherwood, which I thought then, as my grandfather had been in the Navy, must have been a ship on which he had served. There never was an HMS Catherwood. It didn't exist. It was, in fact, the name of a bus company, because the man's name was Catherwood and his initials were HMS. There's the Calcutta flying over Belfast City Hall. You'll notice some of these pictures I had to scan direct from, or photograph direct from the newspapers in Belfast Newspaper Library. It's because they're quite simply, the digital images are very obscure, and the actual newspapers are very, very fragile. And in fact, they let me into the back store wearing white gloves, and an accompanying librarian would come in with me and turn the pages for me, basically, while I took digital pictures. So if you've never been, the Belfast Newspaper Library is well worth a visit, and very helpful staff. That's what the interior of the Calcutta looked like. I always think it looks rather a bit like a railway carriage in some ways. That was the galley. And there's the Calcutta moored in the Musgrave Channel. And if you remember, the very first picture showed you the Musgrave Channel in Belfast. Now, 29th, newsletter chartered to Calcutta, 15 passengers departing at 2 p.m. Invited guests met outside the newspaper's office in Donegal Street and boarded a bus from this local company, which had Imperial Airways signs affixed for the occasion. The bus took the party to the County Down side of the loch, where a motorboat was waiting at the waterside to take them out to the Calcutta. A passenger wrote, "Inside were comfortable seats equipped with collapsible tea trays. I had a big porthole all to myself on the starboard side. For a second or two after going on board, the passengers were all silent, taking stock. Newsletter had 2 photographers on board, one in the cabin and one in the front compartment, where you see they just raising the anchor there. So he was open to the elements. Some remarkable aerial photographs were thereby taken. Newspaper described the flight thus: I looked through the porthole and saw we were slipping away from the channel. Then all 3 engines of the machine roared out their challenge to nature. Outside, the spray was angrily lashing at the windows. It was nearly time to be up in the air, I thought, and had another peep through the porthole. Yea, gods, the loch was far below us, and those funny little things were ships. The water was like a sheet of tinted glass. We flew down the loch at heights between 1,000 and 1,500 feet in the direction of Carrickfergus, where the battlements looked like a child's sandcastle, en route passing over White Abbey and Green Island, where I live now. At Carrick, she turned southwest and returned over Grey Point, Cultra and Hollywood. For 10 minutes or so, we had the unique experience of seeing our own city stand out like some gigantic piece of bas-relief. Streets, well-known buildings and prominent landmarks were easily recognisable. There's the City Hall. Look, Shaftesbury Square. It's like a penny stamp. There's Donegal Street and the newsletter office, just near St Anne's Cathedral. Oh, look, the Antrim Road, Cliftonville, the Falls Road, Victoria Park. The descent was not unaccompanied by thrills for those of us who were making the trip for the first time. The first stage in the descent was akin to the feeling one gets in a lift. Then I got used to it and suddenly saw the water was just a few feet below the machine. The actual point of contact passed unnoticed. The pilot had made a perfect landing, and a cheery voice called through the hatchway, "Well, did you enjoy it?" As the motorboat left the side of the machine, a call of 3 cheers for the Calcutta was responded to with a zest which spoke volumes. That's just a little map showing the air routes of these early years, and you'll see 1924-25, Stranraer, Glasgow, Carlisle, as I mentioned, Liverpool, and then the other routes in England. 1920s were a time of experimentation, and no viable aircraft were really around. It had come down to really one air route altogether by the end of the decade. Then we had the breakthrough. 1930s, early 30s, the de Havilland Company produced the DH-84. The Airspeed Company produced the Airspeed Ferry. Spartan Company produced the Spartan Cruiser. And these were all much more commercial. They could fly a bit faster, they could carry more people or cargo, and the radio fit was a lot better. The unsung hero of this period was a man called John Sword, who was a bus operator but created Midland and Scottish air ferries. And you'll see there a timetable of Midland and Scottish, because on 31st of May 1933, the first regular sustained civil air service landed at Aldergrove. Flights are operated twice daily in the summer months, leaving Renfrew at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m, making the return journey at 10:30 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. Hired Rolls-Royce or Daimler limousines provided free transport to the respective city centres. The fares were £3 single and £5 return. Telegraph reporter said, "The company have a fleet of 12 commercial aircraft, the largest of which is the Avro 10, a beautiful machine and the last word in luxury." An important feature of the aircraft is that for any reason one of its engines should fail, the machine will continue as if nothing had happened, equipped as it is with special navigational instruments, which was a compass basically, which enabled the pilot to fly through any weather and in any circumstances. But the idea of procedural landings was actually being developed as well, so you could fly a certain distance out on a compass bearing and change the bearing at a certain timing and so on. The writer may be guilty of a little exaggeration, but was equally taken by the interior fit. Other accessories include a very efficient Marconi wireless installation. The passenger cabin is attractively decorated in silver and red, and each passenger has a seat beside a window, enabling him, notice him, not her, to have a magnificent view of the sea and the country. Above each window seat is a ventilator for individual use, and there are light luggage racks as well as accommodation for heavier baggage. And the newsletter's correspondent was equally impressed. The return flight was, if anything, even more enjoyable. We crossed the Ulster coast at Cushendall, and a splendid view of the glens of Antrim were presented. In a minute, one is able to see more of the beauties of Ulster from the air than in a week by any other means. Telegraph's man agreed. "I will never forget this, my first flight, and I will certainly look forward to further opportunities for seeing my country from higher altitudes." Now, the Marquis of Londonderry was a great supporter of aviation in the interwar years. That's an Avro 10, by the way. You can see it's a tri-motor. That's later developed in the Avro 19. That's inside the aircraft. I'll go back away from him for a minute. An engineer employed by Midland and Scottish recalled, "Another memorable flight was from Romford to Houghton, Liverpool, and then on to Aldergrove. Captain Mallet was the pilot, and I was the flight engineer. The passengers were Lord and Lady Londonderry. The weather report for Aldergrove was very bad. Base of cloud 300 feet with poor visibility. But as his lordship had a very important conference in Belfast that evening, we pressed on and proceeded on a time factor, having flown above cloud across the Irish Sea. We started to descend, hoping to break cloud, and having reached 1,000 feet with no sign of a break, we turned 90 degrees to starboard to position us out to sea northeast of Belfast. His lordship sensed that we had altered course, came up into the cockpit and suggested we could land on his own strip at Mount Stewart. We got down onto the low cloud and proceeded up Belfast Lock to Carrickfergus, and then round the back of Divis at approximately 200 feet to Aldergrove. There was quite a reception party to greet them, and when he got out, Lord Londonderry told them what a good flight they had had. Mallet and I later mused over the thought of landing the Avro 642 on a short grass strip at Mount Stewart. Very hairy indeed. You could land a hornet moth or a post moth on Mount Stewart, but I wouldn't have landed a big Avro. Now, this gentleman. The major domestic airline in the 1930s was Railway Air Services, which was owned by the 4 railway companies. The first railway air service schedule between Croydon and Aldergrove, stopping at Birmingham and Barton on the way and then Renfrew afterwards. This was flown 20th of August 1934. The aircraft were met at Aldergrove by the Lord Mayor, Sir Crawford McCullough, and by that chap, Sir Harold Hartley, who was Vice President of the LMS Railway Company, and he handed over the first bag of mail. The Imperial Airways Staff News of 22nd of August 1934 commented, "The volume of mail and the number of passengers on the first service made it necessary to operate from Glasgow to Croydon in duplicate, and despite the fact that a violent storm of wind and rain was experienced at Glasgow, at the advertised time of departure, the 2 airliners left to schedule, although most adverse weather conditions were encountered when they completed their flight to Belfast and left again for Manchester. Over the Irish Sea, they ran into the centre of a depression and weather conditions became abnormal. The wind reached gale force and dislocated steamship services, and when the airliners arrived at Manchester after a stormy flight, it was decided the conditions made it inadvisable to proceed to Birmingham and Croydon. The mails were sent on by train. The gale abated during the evening and enabled the aircraft to proceed from Manchester to their scheduled destinations the following day." Now, Sir Harold could testify to the severity of those conditions because as they were coming across the Irish Sea, the aircraft hit turbulence, which caused it to descend several hundred feet with great rapidity. Sir Harold wasn't wearing his seatbelt, so as the airplane went down, he went up. And thoughtfully, the aircraft had been provided with an escape hatch, which was made of, well, linen. And unfortunately for Sir Harold, his head went through the escape hatch, out into the slipstream. Luckily, the aircraft then started to pull up, and he dropped back down into his seat again, luckily sustaining no serious injury. But gives you a bit of an idea as to how potentially hazardous air travel still was in those days. That's a Spartan cruiser at Newtonards, because the first civil airport for Northern Ireland after Malone was established at Newtonards, the airfield that's still there today, on land owned by Lord Londonderry, the Ards Airport. And that was the civil airfield for Northern Ireland from 1934 to 1938. Some services transferred in 34, 35. All services had transferred by 36. And as I say, they lasted through until 1938. That's the Spartan cruiser. That is Lord Londonderry again with the Midland and Scottish 642. Lady Mary Bury is on the far side, died not that long ago and was a great supporter of aviation. That's air traffic control at Ards, which I think is rather nice. The vehicles in Austin. That is de Havilland DH-89 of Hillman's Airways. Edmund Hillman was a civil aviation pioneer in the 1930s, not unlike Michael O'Leary, because he didn't pay his pilots very much, because he described them as glorified bus drivers, which I'm sure the pilots didn't appreciate too much, but they needed the job. Sadly, Edmund Hillman died at a fairly early age. He had a massive heart attack in 1937, I think it was, but he was a pioneer of his time. That I've just thrown in because that was a visitor at the Ards airfield. That was when von Ribbentrop paid a visit And Lady Mary said he was an extremely rude man when I spoke to her about it. She didn't like him at all. But that's his Junkers Ju-52 parked at the Heirs airport. Now, we come to 1938, and the City Council, Short Brothers and Harland, Harbour Commissioners had been working on constructing an airfield at Sydenham. This was reclaimed land, which was thoroughly drained and prepared and rolled and dried out and so on, and it became Belfast Harbour Airport in 1938. On the 16th of March, it was opened by Mrs. Neville Chamberlain, the wife, obviously, of the Prime Minister. And she described this in her speech as a magnificent airport, which not only added to the reputation and resources of the city, but also created a valuable national asset. The opening ceremony was broadcast nationally on radio by the BBC. Civic dignitaries included the Duke of Abercorn, Sir Crawford McCulloch, Sir Ernest Herdman, who is the chairman of the Harbour Commissioners, and according to the programme for the day, the assembled dignitaries and guests were entertained by Miss Marie McRae and her string orchestra to a selection of popular hits. Commercial flying was transferred from Ards, with the first two flights being to Glasgow and the Isle of Man, as you'll see there. That's a plan of the airfield, which is still in roughly the same place today, though it stretches way down to the far right-hand side, obviously, and they've put in considerable length of runway. So the commemorative brochure stated, "The airport will be one of the finest in the United Kingdom. It is particularly easy to find from the air and is situated at the head of Belfast Lough, adjacent to the deep water ship channel and within the boundaries of the city. One of its outstanding features is that it can be reached in 6 or 7 minutes by motor car from the centre of the city." Newsletter said, "The Harbour Airport at once becomes one of the acknowledged sights of the city. A fine aerial castle junction." And if you don't know Belfast, that's just one of the main meeting points in the centre of town. Functioning daily as a practical example of all that high-speed airways can now achieve. We're nearly there. That's Mrs. Neville Chamberlain opening the airport. The tall chap beside her is indeed Sir Ernest Herdman. And here is a de Havilland 86 airliner, which is a larger version of the 84 and the 89. And this is the inauguration by Railway Air Services of the flights from Belfast. Railway Air Services was closely linked to Imperial Airways. So the Imperial Airways News Bulletin stated, "Among the many facilities provided by the summer schedules of Railway Air Services are improvements in the Royal Mail route between London and Belfast. 2 services in each direction are to be flown daily, providing connections at the London Airport Croydon with the majority of air services to and from the chief centres of Europe. Passengers leaving Rome, Cannes, Copenhagen, Bâle or Berlin in the morning will, for example, be able to have tea on the same day in Liverpool or Belfast. In the reverse direction, passengers leaving Belfast at 9 a.m. will be in Paris at 2:45 p.m, Amsterdam at 3 p.m, Cologne at 4:15 p.m, and Geneva at 7:45 p.m, which is not too bad at all. And if you consider having to check in a couple of hours beforehand now and getting through the traffic to the airport and waiting for your luggage to come off, is probably not that much faster today, unfortunately. That's inside the airliner, the DH-86. That's the pilot's compartment. It can either be dual pilot or, and the one on this side here, that's you got a radio operator in that one as well. That's what the Harbour Airport looked like, and you can see in the background this Cave Hill. That's an aerial shot of it, and you can see on the left-hand side there's a DH-86 and a DH-84, and the little terminal building to the right, just near the hangars. That's just another nice view, 1938, DH-86. That is what it would have looked like had the Second World War not taken place. There were plans to build that lovely Art Deco terminal, which sadly didn't happen because World War II got in the way. Now, this is the end of the presentation. Only really two more things to say. Sadly, Sir William Turner didn't live to see the fulfilment of his ambitions for the city, as he died in 1937. The Second World War would soon bring a halt to civil aviation for the duration. With the rapid expansion of air travel, which wartime necessity produced, flying was never so adventurous again, though there are still plenty of tales to tell of the later 1940s and 1950s through to the age of mass global transport of today. However, those will keep for another day. Thank you very much.